This section's called the old story, okay? So at the beginning of the parable that I wrote, there's a 10-year-old named Adam, and he's told a story of everything by a grandfather whom he loves. The story begins with spirit, okay? So I'll read this little passage, okay? There was nothing else, said grandfather, no earth, no sun, no moon, no stars, nothing, only spirit. And then the spirit breathed, and out they came. Earth and sun, moon and stars, hills and creeks and fields, thunder, lightning, meteors, all in a single breath. The spirit gave a name to what its breath had made. The name was matter. It was a word that grandfather hadn't used before, or at least not like that. Okay. And then another breath, and fish were swimming in the creeks, and birds were flying in the air, and deer were walking on the hills. Skunks were sleeping in their holes. Things were growing, flowers and trees. To each of them the Spirit gave a seed, its very own. To each it gave a name, and to all of them it gave the name of life. First spirit, then matter, then life, thought Adam. He was watching how grandfather was laying the pieces down. He had never seen him be so careful. When all the pieces were in place, grandfather paused. He blew sharply on his fingers just once, and then he looked at Adam. That's where you come from, he said. You come from the breath of God. Okay. So this is a version of what you might call the old story. It's a story of creation out of nothing. And then notice the order of events. First spirit, then matter, then life. And the conclusion, you come from the breath of God. So we associate stories like this with the book of Genesis, but that's not exactly correct. In the opening verses of that book, matter coexists with spirit. The earth is already present, although without form. Water is present too, and a divine wind, sometimes translated as the Spirit of God, is described as moving over it. It's only much later in the Bible, in an obscure verse in 2 Maccabees, that the Bible refers to God as making heaven and earth out of things that were not. But basically, this is the story that I grew up on. Okay, so I grew up in Chicago at a Roman Catholic parish, St. Margaret Mary's, late 1940s. And speaking of geography, that's an interesting idea because geography is involved. It was a Catholic neighborhood. The community center was the Catholic school, rectory, convent, church, and blacktop, because that's where you could go to play. And that literally was the community center. That's where you went. And there were some kids who went to public school in the neighborhood, but that was across a busy street. So I grew up in a certain geography, really, I realized, that with meaning and in a place for that meaning to be. And a picture I remember is a picture of just a poster on the wall, and it was God and the earth. And God was an old man, benevolent old man. He was here, and the earth was just standing out here. I call it the basketball earth because it was about the size of a basketball. God wasn't in the middle of a dribble, but it was just God and the earth. And that was the picture that I had. And that's a picture that goes very much with the old story that was my unarticulated background, that was my geography, if you will. So let's think about Thomas Berry's words here. And you can think about that story, your story that you grew up on. Did that story shape emotional attitudes? Did it provide life purpose? Did it energize action? Did it consecrate suffering? Did it integrate knowledge? Did it guide education? With that story, did you wake up in the morning and know where you were? So I did wake up and know where I was. Okay. Looking back today, I can say that I loved the story that I grew up on. I loved the people who told it. I loved the atmosphere in which it was told. I loved that God with the basketball earth. I held all of it sacred. This was the web on which I lived my life. This was my unarticulated background, the old story. Yes?
The thought occurred to me while you were saying that I could say yes to all of those points that you just mentioned, but I thought, one of the most affirming thing for me is, what if I hadn't had that story? What if I didn't have that?
Oh, great question. Think about that now. What if you didn't have that story? Now here's another.
What's really interesting is that while I was with a group that was learning to tell the story in an organization called Education for Ministry, a young man of about maybe 20 years old found his way into the building, and he needed to learn the story. He was desperate to hear the story, and in sitting down and speaking with him, he had not heard the story. The closest he had come was Jesus Christ Superstar. Mm-hmm. He was unchurched. His parents had never taken him to church, had never.
Interesting.
And so there are people out there who, more and more perhaps, who are not hearing the story. It was just a real interesting experience.
Yes, I mean, those are some great thoughts. What if you never heard the stories? Yeah. What if you never heard the story? And so, I mean, you can either hear it as a child and kind of grow up on it, but what if you get to age 20 and you've never heard this story, or maybe any sort of story? I mean, should you really have a kind of story of everything to grow up on? Is that good for kids? And of course, the experience that I described, it was a community shared story. But then, given all the good things apparently that such a story does, what's it like to leave the story? What's it like to give up that secure geography? That security in a sense of meaning.
Well, I'll complicate things
Good.
a little bit.
We like complication.
My parents were missionaries for
Yes.
40 years, so that's how I grew up. And I was sent away to boarding school when I was 6. And we didn't live together. There were 7 children altogether eventually. We didn't live together as a family for any length of time, again, except for 2 other years when we were on furlough in the US. And so, just to make a very long story short, I definitely grew up with a story. Mm-hmm. And it was a story that my parents were doing God's will, mm-hmm. and what could be better than what they were doing. Mm-hmm. And they did a whole lot of good. Mm-hmm. But the understory that never got told was that they were sacrificing their children in the process. Mm-hmm. And so sure. I mean, I think in your case, you're saying your story didn't have I don't know. It sounds like your story didn't have that understory that really can mm-hmm. call into question the big story, the story that you're never supposed to disagree with. Mm-hmm. That in a lot of ways was a good story.
Mm-hmm. Could I ask how you came to terms with that?
I spent 10 years writing a book.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Well, I've worked, it's been a major work of my adult life to come to terms with that.
Right, and think of the way she I'm sorry, your name?
Catherine.
Catherine said that, the big story, the official story, and then the understory, which kind of doesn't undergird this, it undermines the story in some way, yeah?